With Chapter 13, we start the macroeconomics part of the course. Macroeconomics refers to the aggregate performance of the overall economy, right? And your chapter title here is Measuring the Overall Performance of Economic Systems. When we think about macroeconomics, we're thinking about usually, the kind of things we see in the news. GDP, gross domestic product, unemployment, inflation, business cycles, boom and bust, all the kinds of things that are sort of newsworthy that, we generally think about as being economic policy. Many of those fall under macroeconomics. There are several things going on in Chapter 13. In this video, I want to focus really on two of them. I want to talk a little bit about GDP, and then I want to talk about unemployment. There's some discussion in the chapter of inflation. You have a separate reading or a video on inflation. You have also a separate reading on GDP that's worth taking a look at. But what we'll do here in this video is we'll talk about GDP. We'll talk a little bit about this idea of aggregate fluctuations. What do we mean by that? And then we'll talk a little bit about unemployment. So let's start with GDP, gross domestic product. And it might be useful here if you want to pause and pull up the PowerPoint or have the book handy. Might be useful for much of what we're going to do with this lecture. So what do we mean by GDP? The definition of GDP, as you can see from the slides, is the market value of final goods and services produced within a country in a particular period of time. Right? So this can be, when we think about a particular period of time, it can be annual, yearly data. It can be quarterly data, the end of every 3 months. And GDP in the United States is reported quarterly and annually. It's often revised. You'll see a preliminary report, and then sometime later that will get revised. What's important to understand about GDP is that it's a measure of the flow of spending. You can think of it like a pipe carrying water, right? That what GDP measures is how quickly is the water moving through the pipe. It doesn't measure well-being or wealth or anything like that. It's a measure of really of spending, right? Of the flow of spending, how spending is taking place. And that's one of the problems with GDP, as you'll see from the supplemental reading and some things we'll raise in a minute. That's one of the problems. Just as a number, in 2013, GDP in the United States was $16.8 trillion. That was about $53,000 per person in the United States. So let's break down that definition. Really, it comes in four pieces. Market value of final goods and services produced within a country in a particular period of time. So what do we mean by market value? We measure GDP using market prices. That's what we're talking about. When we measure GDP, we're talking about the prices that goods sell for on the marketplace. That's how we measure it. Final goods and services. The key thing about GDP to understand is that we're measuring what the ultimate user purchases, right? So when you buy a loaf of bread at the grocery store, right, we're measuring the market value of that loaf of bread. What we're not doing is also adding in all the inputs into that. So we're not adding the money that's spent for the wheat, for the yeast, for the water, all the other things, eggs, whatever, that go into making that bread. We're only counting the market value of the final goods and services. That is what the ultimate consumer buys. We're not counting what we might call the intermediate goods. Okay? And final doesn't have to equal finished, right? If you purchase a good and then sort of do something else with it, right? That's different. That you're making it into the finished product. But final means, did you purchase it at the store, right? That's what we're talking about here. Okay. When we talk about purchased within or produced within a country, GDP measures the things that are produced within, say, the United States. Before GDP, we used to talk about gross national product, and that was the stuff produced by citizens of the United States, no matter where they were, right? And that's by the permanent citizens, anyway. That we rejected that definition and moved to gross domestic product to measure the things that are produced in the United States. So this is a measure of what's happening in the United States economy. And again, in a particular period of time, as we've said, you can measure it annually, quarterly, all of those things. Okay? So what GDP is trying to get at is, what are we spending on final goods and services? It's important to understand what GDP does not include. There's three big things it does not include. First of all, it doesn't include non-market forms of production. So all the work you do in a household, the cooking, the cleaning, and so on, right, that doesn't count towards GDP. What's amusing about that is, right, imagine, two couples living next door to each other, and let's just for the sake of argument assume that the husbands work and the wives stay at home. All the work that those wives do in their house does not count towards GDP. But suppose the families got together and said, well, look, why don't I pay your wife to come over to my house and cook and clean, and then you pay my wife to come over to your house and cook and clean. Now, assuming they're equally good at it, all the same work gets done, but now we're paying them, right? So there's no difference in total output, but if we paid them, that would count towards GDP because now this has a market value attached to it. So this is one of the problems with GDP, right, is that it doesn't, it only accounts for these market forms of production, and there's sort of ways to rig it, right? Rig it isn't probably the right word, but to sort of make that number not quite tell the truth. Interesting questions whether we should count non-market forms of production. Should we count charitable work, voluntary work, right? One feminist critique of GDP is that it doesn't count a lot of work that is predominantly women's work. So that's one thing missing from GDP. Doesn't count black market production, right? So the whole drug trade doesn't count as part of GDP. Should it? Interesting question. And finally, it doesn't account for opportunity costs. It doesn't really get us to understand economic value added. Again, it just looks at the flow of spending. Okay, and again, it's also not a measure of all purchases. It doesn't count those intermediate ones, right? And there's an example in the couple examples in the textbook that illustrate this, right? So you can look at GDP either as being the sort of total flow of spending, or total national income, right, which represents sort of the value added from each step along the process. And again, I encourage you to read the textbook to find out more about that. So when we talk about this idea of aggregate fluctuations in the economy, what we're talking about is sort of movements in GDP, movements in unemployment, right? We know GDP historically grows at roughly an average of about 3% per year. That's considered pretty good growth, but it also fluctuates greatly. For example, in the Great Depression from 1929 to 1933, GDP declined by 30% over that period. The Great Depression was bad, but what we saw happen in the Great Recession a decade ago was the second worst. In that period, depending on exactly how you measure it, either between the end of 2007 or the beginning of 2009, or the start of 2008, beginning of 2010, see about a 5% decline in GDP. And it's worth noting, right? That was considered pretty bad in the Great Recession, but compare that to 30% over 3 or 4 years in the Great Depression, and you can see why it was a depression, not a recession. But also in roughly that same period of the Great Recession a decade ago, unemployment went up from 4.7% to 10%. So that gives you a sense of that. The part of what we want to know is what causes these fluctuations, why isn't growth smooth, why are there recessions? And we'll be trying to answer those questions both in this chapter 13, but also in 14 and 15 as well. And to do that, one of the things we need to understand is unemployment. And this has become an issue, right, as the unemployment rate has fluctuated greatly over the last decade, and people have argued that official unemployment rates somehow don't measure exactly what's going on. So let's talk about this for a minute and sort of see if we can understand how economists measure unemployment and how that relates to these bigger questions. First of all, the key distinction that we have to make is between unemployed and not employed. When economists talk about unemployment, we're talking about people who are looking for jobs but can't find them. We're not talking about people who aren't looking for jobs. So from the start, that's the distinction we have to make here, right? If you are staying home, taking care of children, and not interested in working, you are not unemployed. We'll talk about what exactly we mean by what term we use for that in a minute. But you're not unemployed. If you're looking for a job and can't find one, you're unemployed. Okay. Now the tricky part here, and we'll come back to this, is what if you've been looking for a job for a number of months or a year, and then you just give up because you can't find one? Official statistics will say, okay, well, you're no longer unemployed because you've stopped looking. Yet somehow it doesn't seem quite right to put that person perhaps in the same category, say, as a retiree who's not looking, or as a homemaker, right? Doesn't seem quite the same. Yet, in fact, that's the way the statistics work, is that what we measure is, are you or are you not looking for a job? Well, the question to think about is, can unemployment ever be zero? Would we want that? Is all unemployment bad? Right? One way to think about this is, don't we want to some degree, unemployment to take place when businesses close because they're being inefficient. Workers will lose their job. It will take them some time, right, to find new work. We sometimes call this frictional unemployment. But that seems like a good thing, right? We wouldn't want people locked into their jobs forever, because that would mean that businesses were locked in forever. And if businesses weren't doing their job, if firms weren't pleasing consumers, we couldn't do anything about it because we couldn't unemploy the workers, right? So some level of unemployment, right, seems part of the sort of natural growth cycle of the economy, seems part of what it means for there to be a sort of dynamic, ever-changing economy. So how do we calculate the unemployment rate? It's based on survey data. The Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys 60,000 households, and there are some other measures that are used to look at unemployment. We're going to focus on the Bureau of Labor Statistics one. And it starts by referring to what we call the non-institutional population, age 16 or older. That means people who are not in prison, not in a hospital, right? Anyone who's in those sorts of situations don't count as part of the folks who might or might not be unemployed, right? So that's what we mean by the non-institutional population, all right? That group of people, the people who are above age 16 and not in one of those institutions, right, constitutes what we call the potential labor force. They are people who could be potentially working. And what we want to know is how many of them are working, how many of them are not working, how many of them are looking for jobs, so on. So one of the first numbers we calculate is what we call the labor force participation rate. The labor force participation rate refers to the percentage of that non-institutional population that's actually in the labor force. That is, who is either looking for a job or has a job. All right? So they are people who are interested in working. They might be working, they might not be working, but they're in the labor force. So for example, retirees, homemakers are not in the labor force. They have decided, I'm not looking for a job, I'm done. They're part of that non-institutional population, age 16 and over, right? But they're not in the labor force. And we often break down labor force participation rates by various demographic factors. We talk about the labor force participation rate of women, of men, whites, blacks, of teenagers, of adults, right? We can break this down in all kinds of different ways. So what does it mean to be unemployed by these definitions? Well, first, you have to be in the non-institutional population, right? So over 16, not in jail or in a hospital, etc. You have to have been without employment during the week that the Bureau of Labor Statistics surveys you. So they say, are you working, are you not? You say, no, I haven't worked this week. Okay. That means at least potentially you're unemployed. And here's the key. You have to have made specific efforts to find employment sometime during the prior 4 weeks. So again, if you are age 34, you're at home taking care of kids, haven't been done paid work in the last week, and you're not looking for work, you haven't made specific efforts to find employment, then you're not unemployed. To be unemployed, you have to be looking and not finding work. And the last criterion for being unemployed is you have to be presently available for work. That is, if a job offer came your way today, you'd have to be able to start whenever that offer was effective. So, to be unemployed, 4 things: part of that non-institutional population, without employment during the survey week, made specific efforts to find employment during the prior 4 weeks, and be presently available for work. So now we can have a couple of, put these into definitions, right? We can think of the total labor force includes the people who are employed, that is, people looking for work and who have a job, plus the people who are unemployed, that is, people who are looking for work and can't find a job. Another number we can use here is what we call the labor force participation rate, mentioned earlier, right? And that simply refers to the number of people in the labor force, employed plus unemployed, divided by the non-institutional population. So what percent of the non-institutional population is in the labor force? That's the labor force participation rate. The unemployment rate, however, is the number of unemployed people divided by the labor force. So when we say the unemployment rate is 4.1%, which I think is the latest March number, what that means is 4.1% of the people in the labor force don't have a job. That is, 4.1% of the people either looking for work and not finding it, or having it, are not finding it. That's the unemployment rate. It does not include, again, people outside the labor force, like retirees, students, and say homemakers. Okay? So when we think about unemployment, there's really 2 key choices people face. First choice they face is, am I in or out of the labor force? Am I looking for work? and interested in working or not. So when a couple decides, say the husband's going to stay home and raise the kids and not work for not do paid employment in the marketplace, that's a decision, in or out of the labor force. The second decision people face is, should I accept or not accept a particular offer of employment? So I'm in the labor force. Someone offers me a job. Should I accept it? And when we think about both of those decisions to be in or out of the labor force, when we think about the decision to accept or not accept a particular offer of employment, there's all kinds of changing costs and benefits that might affect them. I mean, even the example we just mentioned, right? So a couple has their first child. That's certainly going to affect which one of them, or maybe neither, is in or out of the labor force. It's also going to affect the particular way they view specific job opportunities, right? Regulations matter. Minimum wage, things like minimum wage laws and occupational licensure matter for the ability and willingness of people to accept, say, a particular offer of employment. Things like unemployment benefits affect whether people are in or out of the labor force. Other kinds of government welfare programs will affect that as well. If you lose certain kinds of benefits because you're working rather than being out of work, right? If those benefits change in any sort of way depending on the kind of job you have, right? All of those matter for the choices people make. So if you want to think about this from the sort of economic way of thinking perspective, right? What's interesting about the labor market, about employment decisions, is that it's a market too, like any other, and our expectations of additional benefits and costs objectively evaluated matter, and the decisions people make about being in and out of the labor force or taking particular offers of work matter. So as we think about this idea of aggregate fluctuations, right, we know that during recessions and depressions, the unemployment rate goes up. What we want to try to understand, perhaps, is why is that, right? What's changing about the costs and benefits, both to workers and to employers, that might cause this, right? Why do we see sometimes when unemployment rates are high, other times when unemployment rates are low? And one of the questions people are asking quite a bit these days is, what about the labor force participation rate? One of the things that we've seen over the course of the last decade or two, right, and there's a graph in the PowerPoint that shows it, right, is that even though the unemployment rate has been coming down since the Great Recession, so has the labor force participation rate. And the debate among economists is whether that drop in the labor force participation rate is just a reflection of sort of long-term trends of people perhaps retiring earlier or spending more time in school before they work, or whether that's a result of people dropping out of the labor force, right, of not being able to find work, which makes the unemployment rate look lower, right? If people drop out of the labor force, there are no longer as many people looking for work and not finding it, so that lowers the unemployment rate. But it's not clear that's a good thing, right, if we have people dropping out of the labor force because they can't find work, right? So again, all kinds of really interesting questions here to think about, and thinking about these in the context of the recovery from the Great Recession, which has been particularly slow. Okay, so there's some things to think about with gross domestic product, GDP, and unemployment. As I said, you can, this chapter also covers inflation. There is another video by me that you can watch that talks about inflation. There's also a supplemental piece reading by me that looks at some issues involving GDP. The one suggestion I would make is to pay particular attention to the chapter. The chapter has a lot of details, sort of definition type stuff in it. And for this chapter and this material, that's really what's important here. So you need to be able to understand what we mean by GDP, how we define it, how we use it, what we mean by unemployment, all the things we've just been talking about, and to understand a bit about inflation. So with that, you should, again, take a look at the short video on the cost of inflation, as well as reading the supplemental reading on GDP, and that should set you up nicely for Chapter 13.